Being a monopolist is not illegal in the US. Calls by like OpenAI for AI regulation. They're in the driver's seat. Knowledge and decisions is really let's take Hayek and let's turn him up to 11. So if I say price theory, I'm thinking through things like supply and demand.
It's not that any one participant is wrong, but each one is looking at their own context and obviously for their own self-interest. You can't do good to somebody by forcing them. The moment that you put a gun at somebody's head, whatever claim it is to whatever good it is you're trying to achieve goes out the window.
Welcome back to the Gold Exchange podcast. My name is Benjamin Vern Nadelstein. I am joined as always with founder and CEO of Monetary Metals, Keith Weiner, and our special guest for the day, Brian Albrecht. Brian is the chief economist at the International Center for Law and Economics. Brian, how are you doing today?
I'm living the dream right now.
Brian, I want really quickly for you to tell our audience, if they don't follow your Substack or your Twitter, who you are, what you do, and some of your expertise.
Yeah, so I'm the chief economist at the International Center for Law and Economics. We work on law and economics related policies. I tend to work on competition policy, things like antitrust, mergers, things related to that. I'm an economist by training. I did a PhD in economics. I was a professor for a while. Now I've kind of moved more into the online education space through the Substack, as you said, and then through ICLE policy area. Still doing academic work, particularly around economic theory, but a little bit around market power, dynamism in the economy, things like that. But really, kind of again, I'm the one bringing the econ heavy in the International Center for Law and Economics. That's my role.
And Brian, I know we're going to get into mergers, acquisitions, monopolies, antitrust, all that stuff. But I want to start with your Substack because you guys kind of go to a basic fundamental question, and that is price theory. So I know a lot of people know what prices are. Okay, it's the stuff I pay for at the grocery store, but what's price theory?
Yeah, so it's we're trying to carve out a niche for the way that we think about basically microeconomics, but a little bit of macroeconomics, and trying to, distill things down to very, very simple things. And we think that that's the essence of price theory. So price theory, famous in nerdy circles that I'm in, famously is the name of what Chicago under Milton Friedman called their kind of first microeconomics course, all about prices. Where do prices come from? Our basic model is supply and demand. So if I say price theory, I'm thinking through things like supply and demand. Other things that prices do that we kind of trace out, the things that we focus on that makes us a little bit different than kind of pure, like an intro to principles of economics textbook, let's say from a Greg Mankiw or something like that, is we really are interested in trying to trace out how prices kind of filter through the economy. This is a very Hayekian point that we can't just look at this market in isolation. If this price goes up, that's going to affect another market. And so really trying to trace that through prices. And we'll talk about things related to, overall prices, things like inflation. Inflation is just an aggregation of a bunch of different prices. And we need to think of that as, what is happening at the kind of market by market level, the demand for money level, again, thinking through what's happening to prices.
And Brian, you mentioned the Chicago school. So I know for dance, there's different types of schools. And is it true that economics has different schools as well? What made Chicago different? And I know you mentioned Milton Friedman. Who is Thomas Sowell? I know he's big in the Chicago school. Should we be reading more Thomas Sowell?
So Chicago school. So in the mid 20th century, there was kind of a divergence of different schools of thought within economics. There were different schools of thought before that, for sure. But along a few lines, there's kind of a brought together in the 30s around Keynes, 40s around Samuelson, and then there's a splitting up. One of them became known as the Chicago School. That term has a few meanings. Part of it that we push heavily is a focus on kind of microeconomics versus at the time kind of the Keynesian macroeconomics, a real focus on prices, things like that. It also kind of more in the popular narrative also has a different policy implication. Chicago, Milton Friedman, George Stigler's name like that, Nobel Prize winners, they were relatively free market compared to the rest of the economics profession. So they're kind of weird in the way that they approach the science, but also in kind of the policy implications from it. And so they got labeled as a Chicago school based out of Chicago. Now, there are also people based out of UCLA, which kind of we draw a little bit more on. People like Armin Elchin, Harold Demsetz, with both in Chicago and in UCLA. They focus more on property rights, but their analysis of property rights tended to lead them towards, again, kind of free market policy implications. So that's kind of the overarching school. There's lots that's been written on it. Friedman is the big name, but you could dig into a lot of different people from there. Now, one of the students that came out of the Chicago school was actually George Stigler's students, was Thomas Sowell. So Thomas Sowell is a huge name within kind of policy circles, within kind of intro to economics circles, maybe. People who are kind of more free market, as this popularizer of things like basic economics, which is somewhere up there. Got it right there. Which is a kind of an intro to economics book. It's not a textbook, but it's very much an intro to economics book. And Sowell is a free market type, and so he's kind of been associated with Chicago school that way. He's a weird thing. He holds a weird position within economics. He's a huge name. Last time I looked on Amazon, you look at the top 100 econ books, Thomas Sowell has like 8 of them, like a crazy number. But within academic circles, he's not really taken that seriously, mostly because he transitioned out of pure academic work into kind of more policy. He went to Hoover relatively early in his life to do policy work. He got out of academia pretty early, so he's not taken so seriously. I have a piece on our Substack, which says that academic economists, or people who are interested in the real academic part of economics, should take Sowell more seriously. It's built on a paper that I've written with Art Carden that's coming out in the Independent Review at some point, maybe this fall. I forget when it's coming out, but it's available online. Arguing that Sowell has real insights, academic insights, like technical, into how we think about and theorize about economies, particularly around his book Knowledge and Decisions. That one's right next to it. It's the gold one there. I gotta get this is usually hidden, and now I actually get to talk about it. So there, it's cool. But one of the things that Knowledge and Decisions is really let's take Hayek and let's turn him up to 11. Like, let's take this idea that there's dispersed knowledge, that we all know different things, that we should really think about the impacts on knowledge, like how is policy going to change that? Knowledge and Decisions takes that and just carries it to a bunch of different policy areas. Some of them he comes to policy conclusions that I completely disagree with. Other ones I think are really good. But I think his framework for saying, okay, we're going to change this policy, or we're going to maybe consciously or not consciously change this policy. Maybe it's just an evolution, but what is it going to do to information? For example, how, and he points out in the middle to late part of the 20th century, more and more decisions were being taken away from local decision makers kind of on the ground to national level, things like bureaucrats making more decisions, the Supreme Court making more decisions. Okay. And that has costs and benefits. We can argue about particulars, but one thing is it systematically changes the type of knowledge that the decision makers have. And this is a Hayekian point, but I think Sowell really pushes it forward, that for all their wisdom, the Supreme Court just doesn't know the types of things that people on the street know, or that local elected officials know. Some of that's good, some of that's bad, but it's just different. And so we need to, when we're thinking about trade-offs, when we're thinking about how do we explain the transition in policy, we need to take that information side really seriously.
And Keith, when I think about Knowledge and Decisions and Thomas Sowell, I definitely think first about the interest rate, which a lot of people would say, well, we have a kind of centrally planned interest rate. We've kind of got a committee and a bunch of members of the FOMC, and they decide, hey, we checked our policy levers, and with inflation and with unemployment, we decided that the interest rate is X. Versus, one might say before, let's say 1971, and of course prior as well, decisions were more based on marginal savers, marginal borrowers, and of course that decision tree and how those decisions were made were largely affected.
Yeah, I mean, you made my point for me. Thank you. So, yeah, I think, I mean, I certainly agree that decentralized decision making is going to bring a lot more knowledge to bear and a lot more variety of knowledge. It's not that any one participant is wrong, but each one is looking at their own context and obviously for their own self-interest. The real problem begins, it's one thing if a corporation is making decisions nationally, at least they're not picking up a gun and forcing it. But when the federal government's doing it, now it's at gunpoint and they're substituting force for reason. It's the barrel of a gun for individual decision making, and then you always end up with worse they promise better outcomes. That's why they're doing it. I just tweeted about, I don't know if you saw my tweet, Brian, about in the dry western states, they're now saying there's not enough water, we're depleting the water tables, therefore we're going to pay farmers not to grow food. And we're going to take money from the so-called Inflation Reduction Act to pay farmers not to grow food. So what we've done is we've socialized all the water, and which means we've substituted a politicized process for any kind of individual knowledge-based process for how decisions are made. We've subsidized, so the cost of the water is artificially cheap, which means you get too much consumption. And now it's a bunch of interest groups warring over who gets access to the water that suddenly, like everything else on the common greens, all the water is suddenly overutilized and scarce. And so the net outcome of all this is going to be that we're paying farmers not to grow food. So now we're adding more to the budget deficit, and we're going to drive food prices up because we're going to take some food supply offline. And so if we're intending to do all of this in the name of helping the poor by giving them artificial access to cheaper water, we've ended up hiking their food costs, which people will call inflation and expect the Fed to fix by hiking the interest rate, which is the hurdle rate that any farmer outside of the arid West who would think, oh, I'm going to add production to make up for the production that's going offline in the arid West, where these farmers are now being paid not to grow food. Oh, they've just hiked my costs, therefore I can't do it. I don't have a business case. And so,
so Sowell would, what I take from knowledge and decisions of how to think through the different trade-offs and what's happening is, one thing that Sowell really pushes that I think is really important is that at the local level, at the individual level, you can really do a good job of making incremental changes, produce a little bit more of that, buy a little bit less of this, and marginal in the econ jargon, right? And you can kind of adapt to things, especially if prices are allowed to fluctuate. You can adapt to shortages exist all over the place. Supply and demand shift around, hurricanes come, things happen, there's shortages, there's bad stuff, but each individual can then respond, okay, I'm going to reduce my water by a certain amount based on the prices, you're going to reduce your water by a different amount. And that rapidness in which individuals can respond means that we kind of smooth out things, versus the way that feedback works in political systems in general, speaking very broad generalities, is, a problem boils up to a point that then you need an overcorrection or some big step to deal with it, in which another policy is brought into place, right? Because it takes so much effort for policymakers to do anything, good or bad, but it takes them so much. It's, when bad things are happening, they need to get sufficiently bad, and then you do something. And maybe it's just to make up for previous mistakes and whatnot, but it doesn't have this kind of quick back and forth that we just on normal functioning markets where prices fluctuate around. This happens all the time. I buy less this week or more that way based on, what the prices are at the grocery store, what happened to the crop yield. I have no clue why those prices change, but I just make decisions and things. They don't work perfectly, but it's a miracle the ways that they do work.
I was going to say the way you've described that, if you abstract it slightly, that's how a drunk driver reacts to what's going on the road. But is he's veering off because he's not fully competent? It takes him too long to realize that he's veering, and then what does he do? When he finally responds, he overreacts.
Yeah,
so you get an oscillation with a growing resonance until he's finally upside down in the ditch.
Yeah,
the classic one-car collision, and there's no snow and no rain. How the heck did it happen?
this is a real going back to your point about interest rates and that it's a real issue for any sort of monetary policy that's going to be centralized. Is you're going to, because of the lags that are built into the overall way that the policy carries out, the Fed is always going to be reacting to things with a lag. There may be, like, take right now, maybe they've hiked too much relative to in 20 years what we would say would have been a better policy, but they don't know in the moment, so they overcorrect because they were too slow on when inflation was coming up. This kind of overcorrecting is a very common thing within monetary policy. If you look at the 60s and 70s of when inflation spiked up, they overcorrected, recession back up. It's a real concern for any attempt to kind of centralize monetary policy. Now, again, there might be other reasons in which you want that to be the case. I'm not arguing for. I'll let you guys do all the more of that policy type of stuff, but like, we should recognize that is a difference than if we'd have a more decentralized monetary policy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Brian, I'll be the devil's advocate. Okay, so I'm listening to you guys talk, and you're saying that markets are pretty good when prices are allowed to clear. Actors say, hey, I want a little more of this, a little less of that. And that's actually really a unique way to get to the right price, the right supply, the right demand, and people's personal preferences actually move really quickly versus government policy can take ages. And by the time a problem really boils up, the solutions aren't that great. They can overcorrect. That can lead to other problems, so on and so forth. So, okay, so what are you saying that, when market actors do all these things, the market is totally perfect always, then nothing can go wrong? I've heard of something called a market failure. So doesn't that mean that markets aren't perfect?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Markets aren't perfect. Everything in this world is imperfect, right? It's a fallen world. We don't need to get religious or anything, but yeah, there's lots of imperfections all around. There's constraints, there are problems, both the markets and governments. I've always tried to avoid, haven't been perfect, but try to avoid the idea of market failure and even government failure. We can talk about, like, because I want to be explicit about kind of what is the comparison. So whether we're comparing markets and government, if we compare them to some idealized form, yes, real world markets are always going to have problems with that. So, like, so take something like a common pool resource like fisheries. Okay, there's a concern that there's overfishing in certain areas that don't have well-defined property rights over fish. It's kind of hard, especially in large bodies of water, to define any sort of property rights outside of farms. There's a concern about there being overfishing relative to some sort of perfect outcome in which the economist or the social planner imagines. I don't think that any sort of market outcomes live up to that. But the question is comparison of that between other centrally planned ways of allocating fish. What happens? And sometimes it's maybe going to be better. Sometimes it's going to be worse. I mean, the work of Eleanor Ostrom tried to dig into that, especially around fisheries. That's why I use a fishery example. Absolutely, markets fail. I think policy can help in lots of different places. Defining property rights is like a quintessential example of, things that policy can do that, like, lots of economists would agree, further markets in an important way, allocating spectrum auctions or giving property rights over land, first, enforcing those. Like, there's lots of things government could do, but we need to be careful not to compare markets or government to some perfect thing that doesn't exist. Again, it's a fallen world.
Yeah, and
isn't that one of the classic fallacies when people criticize capitalism? They're comparing it to some not just utopian version of socialism, but some fantasy land, cocaine of socialism, where there is no reality. It's just one is free to close one's eyes, smoke whatever's drug of choice, and just imagine how wonderful everything's going to be. And then that's the baseline for socialism, and then capitalism doesn't. So there's a funny, I guess it was a book published in the 19th century by Ambrose Bierce called The Devil's Dictionary. And he just has some very interesting definitions of things in a perverse. He captures the perversity society at that time. And I have a few candidates for words that should be added, posthumously to his book. One of which would be exploitation, which is when somebody works for terms that I would not accept. And market failure is when free people making free choices in a free market with individual rights of life, liberty, property, and contract produce an outcome that I didn't design or I don't want. Then that's market failure. And what else can you say about it? Yes, you get an outcome that some people don't like, but that was the freely chosen outcomes of the participants who has the right to come in and say, you all don't have the right to choose that because you didn't choose right. Now I'm going to force you to choose right by at gunpoint.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a spectrum there of definitely I'm going to force the decisions on you gets avoids that. There are gray areas that are a little bit more I don't know. I spend my time thinking about that I think are important about I think there are ways in which government policy, which at some point involves a gun, maybe can improve things. The question is, how likely is it ahead of time? The question is, if it is not working, if it's making things worse, how quick is the feedback mechanism on that? I think of local neighborhoods that are somewhere between a government and a voluntary organization. It's not. We can come up with examples that are kind of in between, and I think those are interesting to think through. Of why do some local neighborhoods do a really good job at taking care of the streets collectively through this agreement versus other ones that don't? I mean, there's lots of. I mean, it's a big question that we're not going to answer here, but yeah. I'm absolutely with you on the kind of imposing, especially the imposing with no feedback. This ties back to Sowell. It's one thing for me to, I mean, ideally I propose something to you and then I'm an outside observer. I propose something. I'm like a consultant for a company, right? I'm proposing it. And then the person with decision-making rights, the CEO, the managers, whatever, they decide, maybe I'm imposing it, but can I retract that? Can you get out at some not terrible cost? I'm imposing it on a very small neighborhood, but you can leave. You have the option of leaving. It's a little bit different than imposing at the federal level, and the feedback coming to me is going to be different at a local level that I'm imposing. There's just lots of interesting things there to sort through. I think Sowell, to tie it back, and economics help us think through what's going on.
And Brian, you noted
pretty. Let me just interject one more thing. At the risk of probably pissing off half the audience watching this right now, but I'll stick my neck out and take that risk. We saw something with COVID, and particularly the vaccines, and that is that you can't do good to somebody by forcing them. The moment that you put a gun at somebody's head, whatever claim it is to whatever good that is you're trying to achieve goes out the window, and now you're forcing somebody. And I think that there's an awful lot of people that probably would have been happy to take the vaccine, but then feeling forced, became vaccine, rebels or vaccine refuseniks. And I just think that example is clearer because, first of all, it's recent, but also because, it became such a political hot issue, and your loyalty to Team Red or Team Blue almost would boil down to one of two or three issues, and that was one of them, at least for a while. But I think it illustrates that point that no good is going to come out of the barrel of a gun, even if you actually have the I won't say victim, but I'll say the aimees. You're aiming the gun at somebody, even if you have that person's interest genuinely at heart, which usually the bureaucrats don't have. Right? When the Fed is saying we're going to unemploy half the country to make to render them unable to compete with you when you go to the grocery store, so the prices will go down for you because the other half can't afford to be there anymore. They don't have the good of I exaggerate when I say half, but they don't have the good of whichever cohort they want to lay off. They're not even having the good in mind. Now it's a picking and choosing of which interest group to please and which interest group gets the short end of the stick, let alone when it's just outright a crony, corrupt, situation. For example, I don't know if you knew this, but so we have interest rates of 5.5%. The 10-year Treasury has lost almost 25% of its value compared to its high price in the summer of 2020, which presents a real problem for banks that are holding a lot of this on their balance sheet as we Silicon Valley Bank. So what did the Fed do? Is they said, okay, we will reverse repo, which means the bank can bring the bond to the Fed and pawn it and borrow dollars against it. But unlike all, prior reverse repo facilities, the Fed will take those bonds and pay out par, which is the face value, which is what the bank paid back in 2020. Yeah. So they're pawning these things way above market price. That is absolutely a crony sweetheart deal. If I'm holding a bond on my portfolio and I have a loss on it, where can I go to borrow the original amount of money that I paid in 2020? Nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot in there, but I would say absolutely. The second point about interest rates, there's not the good for the people, right? There's different people with different interests, and here you have a way of or take the unemployment one, right? You're effectively, you have to consider some sort of trade-off between the people who gain from raising interest rates and the people who are going to lose from interest rates, just like any sort of price. Now that could generate unemployment, so they could be the losers. That didn't happen. I don't think that necessarily needs to happen. Your example of the banks getting a little bit of extra money, well then, who's swallowing the losses? The Fed is, and then through taxpayers being held liable. They're always in these policy situations going to be some trade-off about who's going to be benefited. And so you can't say that you're doing it for the good of the people. We got to be a little bit more precise about that. But that's true. I mean, that's true for a private company too. I mean, decision makers in a big private company are going to make decisions that will help some employees, some customers. I'm not saying there's not an asymmetry. There is an asymmetry when you have guns involved. Absolutely. Deals with the feedback and the knowledge involved, and
the pretext that you're doing it for the good of the people. When a for-profit company is doing something that they don't have that pretext. They're saying we do this to make money, and
but they don't. I mean, some do. Some say they do it to help their employees. Maybe they don't help their employees. Some say they do it to help their customers. Lots of companies say they're doing it to help the customers, but that's not. I mean, sometimes that's true. Sometimes not. I mean, it's.
And Brian, I find that interesting that it does seem that there is, at least for most people, the average person, there's kind of a psychological bias. We discussed the Nirvana fallacy. It pops up there often, which is, hey, I know that Jeff Bezos, Amazon, they're a big monopoly. They're screwing me over. And it's unfair that Jeff Bezos is a billionaire. He's a total greedy guy. He would do anything to get another dollar. But the people who are putting antitrust lawsuits against Jeff Bezos, those are angels who are working for the public good, who have no other side interests. They're not self-interested in any way. And even though I couldn't name them or the last 3 decisions that they did or whether they were good decisions or bad decisions, I know that they're working for the public good, and I just trust them. Now, you could point out, okay, they did antitrust regulations on these guys when maybe they shouldn't have, and okay, this was clearly a political bias, but okay, those were mistakes, right? We got to trust them this time. But psychologically, it feels really weird because most people only take that same level of criticism and bias against corporations and the billionaires, and usually not towards government bureaucrats and monopolies that the government has. For example, the FDA.
And not against themselves, right? I mean, Friedman has this great quip about, it's always the other guy who's greedy. It's not when when I want to pay, I'm not the greedy one. It's, I deserve it. It's the other people don't. So there's lots of asymmetries. I don't know if anyone has a good understanding of why there is, at least in countries like the US, it seems like the default is to start at the presumption that government action is for the good of the people, private action is not, and then it's like things are failures to live up to that. That's what it always is. It's always a deviation from that. Oh, this time is different, right? They'll do a good job this time. I don't have a good sense. Maybe it's great that we have that. Maybe it's great in the US that we have like this faith in our government and at some level, and that allows us to have a all things considered, by global and historic standards, like a pretty well functioning government. But I don't know. I'm not willing to go too far on that argument, but there is something there about the bias of, yes, of course, these are good natured people who are these are good hearted, well intentioned, doing the best of the people, regulators. Why would they do anything else?
Keith, I'll bring it maybe to you. Is there a trade off? We have a high trust society, which means we trust the government, maybe when we shouldn't. And if we didn't have that high trust society, yeah, we wouldn't trust the government, but then maybe other things don't happen, like markets and so forth.
Yeah, if you don't, I mean, think about healthcare. You know, if you have some sort of disease that requires the surgery, think about the level of trust that you necessarily have to give the surgeon. I mean, you're lying down and saying, make me unconscious and take a knife to me, and but don't do anything I don't want you to do. Just do the one thing that we agreed on in advance, which, based on your advice, I trust is actually the real problem with me and necessary to, you know, cut this tumor out. And you know, I don't know how many people do that every day. I'm going to guess at least tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. And, you know, and rightfully, they trusted their surgeon, they trusted the hospital. They don't wake up in a bathtub of ice water in a hotel room, you know, with a sign that says, we took your kidney, or whatever. Trust is absolutely necessary to have a high level of civilization. And if trust collapses, so will civilization, down to some very rude, you know, low level, or if there's any civilization at all that isn't just open, you know, killing in the streets. But to the other half of your question, Ben, you know, if you have a government that's not worthy of that trust because everybody's scheming to, you know, take something from you and you know, give it to another special interest group, or worse, they're cheating, right? So my definition of inflation, Brian, is the counterfeiting of credit. It's when the borrower has neither the means nor intent to. So they borrow, they call it borrowing, and they're doling out welfare with it. There's no productive asset that's being financed. They have literally no means of paying it back other than taxing you more than their expenses next year. And if they had to borrow to pay, to dole out more than their, you know, taxes this year, they'll never get to be a next year where they can have taxes greater than expenses and pay any of this back. So they call it borrowing, but it's a fraud. It's a monetary fraud. And when you not only allow but actually invite and encourage a fraud at the top levels of society, everyone starts to think, yeah, why, if they can do all this crap, they get to lie and cheat and, you know, change the accounting rules that have been around for 600 years. Why do I have to you know, be a man of my word and be honest? And you know, the fish rots from the head, as the old expression goes. So yeah, it's very dangerous.
Yeah, I think that you know, it's there's it once it becomes a norm, and particularly in places that you put trust in, and that gets degraded, that has lots of bad implications for the rest of society. There's probably something, I should stop talking because I don't know anything about this. There's probably something to the extent that, you know, you see you know, the people in government as sort of like you in some way, and therefore the trust for them is sort of related to the trust for your, like, more intimate group. I don't know anything about that. I would push back on calling that inflation. Perfectly fine with that as the you know, printing of money, issuing of credit without any intent of giving a productive asset for just because that's not the way that most people talk about inflation. So I don't really, I see they're obviously related. I see why that is a, you know, the way that you're thinking about inflation is just, most people, when you say inflation, mean something like, well, most people mean that gas prices are up or grocery prices are up. You know, more specialized economists mean something of some general price level, but it's something about prices, not
There's
about
a very funny
debt
thing
or
with this
credit.
area, which is the monetarists and Friedman foremost among them would say inflation is the increase in the quantity of money, and the logical and necessary outcome of that is rising prices. But then even Friedman himself falls prey to this, you know, one is equivalent to the other because they're cause and effect. And there's this famous quote where he says inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And it's clear from the context he means rising prices is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, but he uses the word inflation to describe that. And I mean, you're right. I'm very well aware that my definition is I'm a maverick or worse, you know, in this regard, and I have my arguments for why I define it that way. But regardless of quibbling over the definition, if they're cheating at the top level, and getting back to COVID, there's certainly a lot of anger over how, the government health authority said, you have to lock down, you have to wear a mask, you have to do all these things that are, at this point, pretty obviously ineffectual. Living inside the vaccine, wearing masks and social distancing and all these things. And, people pointing out that, okay, so if I'm walking into a restaurant, then I'm at high risk of spreading the COVIDs. As soon as I sit down at my table, then there's an invisible cone of anti-COVIDness, and I can take my mask off and it's fine. And there's just a lot of rubbish that our health authorities were promoting during that time. And I don't want to focus on Fauci or who said what or whatever, but rather sort of the general decline in trust in not just the government, but in this case also the healthcare professionals and healthcare intellectuals, the thought leadership, as it were, of healthcare, really, threw a lot of mud on themselves through this. And then, what's going to happen as a result of that, we'll be feeling the consequences of that for decades. That doesn't go away, quickly or lightly.
Brian, as we kind of head towards the end of the interview here, I want to ask you a question about monopolies and antitrust. So most people go, okay, I've heard of monopolies. Monopolies are companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter. These are monopolies. They're really big companies. They buy up all their competition, and there's nowhere else to go, and they treat consumers really badly. So let's go in order. I'll ask you, okay, hey, is this company a monopoly? I'll give you kind of some questions, and you'll fire back and say, no, Ben, you're totally wrong. You're missing it entirely. So let's start with Google. Anytime I want to look something up, it's Google. So Brian, that just has to be a monopoly.
Well, again, getting back to definitions, we need to be careful about what we mean. I mean, Google is the only one that can run Google search. They're the only ones that can run, Google Photos and all their, Google Cloud stuff. So they have a monopoly. They have, through patents, through trademarks, through these things, they have a monopoly on certain activities under the Google name. I have a monopoly on things that are, on my things that come out of our Substack. Now, that's not even true because I have a co-author, but you get the idea. So we need to be a little bit more precise about what we mean. And in antitrust, there are a few kind of rule of thumbs for trying to sort these things out. There's something called a hypothetical monopolist test. Like, basically, you don't want to define the market. I don't want to a monopolist is always relative to a market. I am a monopolist in this market. I am sufficiently close to like one seller in this market, because there's not one seller of all goods. There's one seller in this market. So you need to define the market right. And antitrust has developed rules of thumb around hypothetical monopolists that kind of try to not define too narrowly, but also not too broadly that no one is a monopolist, and these laws never have any bite.
So maybe just to summarize for the average person, they go, okay, you can't be a monopoly because then everything's a monopoly, and that's not really helpful. Like, I'm the most attractive host of the Gold Exchange podcast. Okay, well, that's not really that helpful, right? Or you could say, well, you're competing with everyone in every form of entertainment. Well, then, of course, this show is not a monopoly. So clearly, there's got to be some delineation. And then I think, Keith, this might go to your question about the politicization of law economics, because who gets to make the decision what counts as the market? Because it's clearly not the consumers, because they're going to Amazon and Uber and Google every single day. So clearly not all of them are really hurting. And of course, there are some competitions. I mean, Amazon and eBay, right? Google and Yahoo and Bing and ChatGPT. So the question is, this has now become a politicized question where lawmakers, who hopefully have no self-interest of their own, get to decide, hey, this is the market that we're deciding that you're a monopoly.
Yeah. So there's a back and forth. I mean, just as a non-normative, just to like explain how antitrust works, there's a back and forth between the company who wants to make the market as big as possible so that they, I sell groceries. I also compete for dollars versus, television, and I'm very small relative to television. The companies want to make the market very big, so it doesn't look like they're monopolists. And then the agencies are trying to bring these cases are trying to define it really small, and there's this back and forth between that. So I think, I mean, by reasonable definitions of online search, Google is a monopolist. I mean, they're 90%. It's not truly 100, but it's kind of close. But the question for antitrust, or being a monopolist is not illegal in the U.S. There are other jurisdictions that want to make it illegal, but like having a large market share on the merits, competing for a large market share is not illegal. The law is very clear. The court decisions are very clear on this. Like, how do you become a monopolist? Make the best product, right? For a long time, Netflix was the monopolist in streaming, and that was perfectly okay from lots of different perspectives because they made a new thing. And yes, when you make a new product, you are a monopolist, right? If you
Monetary Metals is the monopolist on yield on gold, paid in gold.
What was that?
Monetary Metals is the monopolist on gold, paid in gold.
Exactly. And so there you've created a market niche that becomes its own market, and therefore, we want to. I want to have policies that incentivize that. In the same way that if we can argue about patent lengths and things like that, but very clearly one of the purposes of a patent is to try to create monopolists, to give them people an incentive to make money and to bring new products into the market. And I have a post on the Substack that's cheekily titled something like "Monopolists Don't Make Enough Money." And the basic idea is because we want to encourage more innovation, and innovators are by definition monopolists. We want to have systems in place that reward innovators a lot. Innovators in the market sense of like creating market value, not creating things that no one in the market cares about.
And Keith, I want to jump to you now. So you've written some interesting articles about the credit gradient. How do you think that applies to this kind of monopoly market share question? And of course, we've now touched on interest rates. Do you see that kind of playing out differently now?
Yeah, so that was written during the long and argue we're still in a falling interest rates trend. We'll see how this the Fed thinking they're going to fight the trend, who's going to win in the end. But the thesis is that even in a normal free market, which we are not, certainly in the monetary system sense, anything normal or free market whatsoever. But even in a free market, obviously major corporations have better access to a lot more credit, much cheaper than startups and mom and pop companies. That's just normal. But as the Fed, pours in liquidity into the deep end of the pool, pushes the interest rate down, then it ends up being a tilting function where the mom and pops and the startups get even more starved. It's like the whole swimming pool. This is the shallow end, but now it's sticking completely high and dry. And these guys on the other end are just drowning in an absolute excess of liquidity. And every time you add more and more regulation, people don't realize regulation means compliance on the part of the business who's trying to compete in the space. Compliance is expensive. Not only that, it has friction, which means you move slower. So if you're talking about something that saps a lot of capital away, who's going to do better? The company that owns 90% market share, or the upstart that's trying to change the rules, fighting the regulator at every step, because the regulations are meant to, or at least designed, maybe with or without intent, to cement and solidify the leader's business model as the right way to do things. The startup is moving slower and therefore rendered much less effective than he would be. And a lot of his capital that would go towards innovation is also expensive. You're sapping all the capital that would fund the innovation to go into compliance. And then we said, geez, why do all the big companies seem to be getting bigger and bigger? And so the small ones are being starved for capital, and they're being burdened down with friction. And they can't move very fast, and they don't have enough scale to cover all the compliance costs. Meanwhile, the bigger guys have more and more capital, cheaper and cheaper. Why are the big guys buying the small guys? Well, if you push the interest rate to zero and beyond, it's logical that all assets in the world would end up on one biggest balance sheet in the world, and everybody else would be acquired. The end.
That's really interesting. I mean, I've heard the regulation point a ton. I think that makes a ton of sense. And not even just around regulation, traditional regulation, tax complications in the tax code, the way that we expense R&D pushes things in favor of big companies. I think these are really important things. The interest rate one, I think, is really interesting. I need to think a lot more about it. Talking with my Substack co-author Josh Hendrickson a little bit about this, it seems to be some historical precedents, not just the current period, of falling interest rates driving concentration. The big companies able to acquire smaller companies. Part of the mechanism seems to be, he's digging into it more, I don't know all the details, but some of the mechanism seems to be the like pure, you have the resources to do it. I don't know what else is involved, but it's definitely, it's plausible. I want to explore it more. It's really interesting. I'll need to see what you wrote on it.
And I think
so the theory of it is that if in order for company A to buy company B, it has to be worth more to company A than B.
Mm-hmm.
Make it worth more if company B has a lower cost of capital, therefore they have a lower discount rate, therefore they put a higher multiple on it, and all the sellers are like, hey, you want to pay us that multiple? It's all yours, buddy. And meanwhile, to the company, it's worth that multiple because it's actually accretive to earnings given their lower implied cost of capital.
That's
what's so perverse about mucking with the interest rate from a central planning perspective is you're mucking with all, you think you're going to try to change inflation. And maybe you do, and maybe you don't. And I have a lot of arguments why they have the sign backwards on their the whole notion. But even if that was right, you're mucking with the discount rate and changing in this credit gradient, you're changing the gradient of discount rates all across the economy with all sorts of perverse incentives, including, so my biggest argument with Thomas Piketty, and I realized a lot of people found fault with his data, that he was basically just cheating in what he said. But, my biggest fault is you're looking at not capitalism and trying to formulate the problems of capitalism. And we have a centrally planned interest rate, and that is definitely not capitalism. In the centrally planned interest rate, yes, everything is concentrating. It absolutely is pushing down wages and pushing up the balance sheets of the major corporations. And then you have a COVID, which obviously further concentrates. Like each thing always seems to work out to the benefit of the major corporations and against, the middle market and the small companies.
And I find that interesting too, which is that you have on one hand, let's say you're a small company. Well, most people go, well, Amazon should have to pay their workers a minimum wage. Well, Amazon probably could physically, economically afford to pay, let's say, their workers $15 an hour. But, if you bring it to the way other side, a mom and pop store, they're like, it's not even worth $5 an hour to have, let's say, my employee, or people who are self-employed. So wait, I have to pay myself $15 an hour unless my single employee business is illegal, right? It starts to make no sense. And so you can see, well, for Amazon, actually more compliance, more regulatory issues are better because it makes their competition, the guy who was starting out in his basement, really have to go, well, I really can't figure out how to do a 1099 form and pay myself $15 an hour. Maybe it's not worth it. So on the margin, they're really pushing out their competitors with each regulation.
Yeah, you're changing this is exactly what I think price theory comes in, and how you want to think about it. You're changing relative prices, that my price relative to my competitor's price. And to Keith's point about like the incumbents versus the challengers, I think of this in the context of calls by like OpenAI for AI regulation. Well, they're in the driver's seat right now. They have to tie it back, they have access to all the capital in the world through Microsoft and whatnot. They can deal with these compliance costs that are relative. It hurts them directly. They have to pay the costs, but it raises the relative costs for the newcomers. And what matters for, how much I can, in a normal market, how much I can charge. It's my cost, but it's also how much the other guy is going to be able to charge you in his costs. And so we can play around with that. Absolutely.
Sales tax on internet purchases was the hot button issue. What is this, 20-something years ago? It blew my mind that Amazon was lobbying in favor that, yes, all internet purchases should be subject to sales tax. I was like, I don't get it. I don't get this before I studied economics. Now I look at it and say, well, of course. So most people don't realize, not only, if you want to sell nationally, you have 50 state sales tax rates. But the sales tax rates aren't just varying by the states. Every city, every county, every fire district, every municipal water district, all have their overrides. And then each one has different tax rates for so-called sins, cigarettes, alcohol, that sort of thing.
Food, clothing, everything is
exemptions for clothing, and some jurisdictions exemptions for food, but certain things are defined as food, but maybe not packaged food. So like a 50-pound bag of rice would be deemed to be food. A salad from the salad bar that you put in the container wouldn't, it becomes very, very, very complicated. Only Amazon or some company of that kind of scale would have the army of accountants and lawyers to get it right for all the jurisdictions and every category of good. If you're a mom and pop vendor and you're like, look, I just want to do some wood carvings and sell them, there's no way. You have to become an Amazon vendor. Amazon is a monopoly, and then they take a 30% charge, bite out of your top line, because you have to sell it on the Amazon market, because only Amazon can, comply with all the tax. And then people want antitrust to go bust them up or whatever. Meanwhile, what's the root cause of it is this crazy sales tax regime. And if you ended that, then all the little mom and pop vendors could do their little wood carving business or their little needlepoint or whatever on their own.
Yeah, I do think there's not enough conversation within the antitrust competition policy space about non-antitrust solutions to these concerns. Like, if you're concerned about big companies being too big, like, what else can you do around compliance, around lots of different policies? There's not enough. I guess as the defense is, like, the FTC doesn't get to choose the tax code. Like, the FTC doesn't, so they're kind of taking as given that this other policy exists, and they're going to respond to it, whether beneficial or not. But like, that's where it is.
Allow me, if I may, to go into my little rant. So I've coined a term that I wish to see in more popular usage than it is, and the term I call compensation. And compensation is deliberately doing the wrong thing on purpose to allegedly address something that you don't want to will not or cannot properly fix. So imagine you have a flat tire. Compensation is letting the air out of the other three. Or imagine you have a Byzantine sales tax code across 75,000 different micro jurisdictions across the country that only a major corporation would have the compliance shops to be able to handle. Instead of fixing that, you say, well, now we want to bust them up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's compensation.
Yeah.
Our political system is just rife with compensation.
So, Brian, as we end here, I want to ask you one question, and then I want to find out where people can find more about your work. So, penultimate question, Brian. What should I ask all future guests of the Gold Exchange podcast?
Great question. One broad one is, what in the last 5-10 years have you changed your mind about that kind of opens up to maybe going in a different direction relative to where you were before? And I think it's an important thing for all of us to think about, how are we constantly learning? Obviously, as you learn more and more, you're maybe not changing your mind all the time. Most of us don't, have big revelations later in life, but I think that's a really helpful thing. If you want to ask them an econ question, ask them what causes inflation, and then you can get to talking about greed and profits and monetary phenomena and all that. Yeah, and then you can really sort out the wheat from the
we don't need economics. We just think it's greed.
Yeah. We'll answer for them. Okay, Brian, where can people find more of your work, and of course the Substack, and then of course the center as well?
Yeah, so laweconcenter.org is a great site for searching around. It's been updated just recently. Great site for searching around on like any sort of policy stuff related to antitrust, competition policy, regulation around like telecommunications. That's one of the areas I don't work on, but other people do. So laweconcenter.org. The Substack is economicforces.xyz. It's not com anymore. It's too expensive. XYZ, economicforces.xyz. And I'm on Twitter at Brian C as in Charlie Albrecht. And I spend too much time on there. So if you want to get at me quickly, that's where to find me.
Brian, I want to thank you so much for coming on to the Gold Exchange podcast. We'll be watching your Twitter, reading your Substack, and of course, we'll see you out on the interwebs. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.